Job chapter 1, 20 through 22. He silences the lips of trusted advisors and takes away the discernment of elders. He pours contempt on nobles and disarms the mighty. Job chapter 1. Should be in there somewhere. Should be. At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I depart. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised."
All right. Thank you, Robin. Technical difficulties happen. Bad things happen sometimes. We're talking about that a little bit this morning. If you've not been with us, you may have read the screen thinking that we were talking about workplace accidents, but that's not how we pronounce the word. For this series, it's going to be Job, not job. And so we're talking about the Old Testament book of Job. In my opinion, an underread book, a book that's under-discussed, but largely because it's not an easy book to study through. It presents some difficulties. It seems to answer questions, but it also seems to ask a lot of questions. In fact, every time I read it, and I've read it several times over the last several months, it leaves me asking more questions, I think, than it answers. But we're going to talk a little bit about the answers that it gives us, the hope that it gives us, even when struggles take place. And we're going to be in that chapters 1 and 2 this morning, if you want to turn your Bibles there. I also, like Josh, was at Camp Cottle this week and had a great time at day camp. Really enjoyed getting to spend some time with your kids and with kids from all over Russellville and the River Valley. It was a great opportunity to get to know many of them and to spend some time with them talking about God and watching them just have an absolute great time. In an effort to try to leave things better than I find them, which is what I always try to do, I graciously removed about 50 chiggers from the place and carried those with me home, which isn't my favorite thing to do. But it happened. It's kind of like I kind of acted like EnviroPest, only a lot stupider. It's like they communicated, white guy without bug spray, go there, and that's what they did. And so I'm enjoying that, and it's been interesting. One of those questions where I'm going to ask God, I think, when we get to heaven, there's going to be a lot of them, frankly, right? I mean, we all have questions that seem to be unanswered in this world, and one of those is, and what were chiggers for? I'm not sure. Why is that a good thing? Mosquitoes, those kind of things. Not sure what purpose they serve, but I'm sure that he's going to have a better answer than I could come up with. And he's probably giggling right now as I scratch. But it's again, a lot of questions that we want to ask him when we get up there. And the book of Job actually deals with some of those, right? It deals with some of those things. Sometimes difficulties happen, struggles take place, and we think, well, if God's all-powerful, could he not have prevented that? Could he not have kept those things from happening? Perhaps more relevant than the pests that we have to deal with these days are questions like, why abortion? Why do we have these school shootings? Why terrorism? Why abuse? Why are young women being taken and sold into sex trafficking? In fact, we all have tragedy around us. We watch the news each time, and when we see that news, we may think, could not God have done something about that? Could he not have prevented that? Think about these questions, big questions. Why does God allow evil to exist at all? Why was there a tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden? Why was that there? What purpose did it serve except to tempt man and woman to turn their backs on God's desires and on what he wanted for them? Why is the devil allowed access to us and allowed to tempt us? Again, those are some of the questions raised by the studying of the book of Job, and probably why a lot of us, frankly, don't do it very often. Because those are difficult questions. They remind us of painful incidents in our own lives, difficult times, tragedy, questions that we've been asked by others who go through tragedy that we simply have no real good answer to. We know part of the answer to some of those. We know part of why those things exist. We know that we don't live in a perfect world. In fact, a lot of times the world that we live in is described as broken. There are things that go wrong. Nothing seems to work right all the time. Even with our best efforts, things go badly. Deals fall through. Plans fail. Jobs end. People die. And all of those leave us with these questions. Part of the reason is we've been told is the nature of love. Love, God is love. And for love to be real, it must be chosen freely, right? And I think that's a part of it. Another part of it is the importance of choice. That choice is available. Love that is obligated, love that is forced, is not really love. And then another reason is the miracle of relationship. When we are chosen, when someone appreciates us for who we are and chooses us without strings attached, it feels really good to us. And that's a miracle. And it's something we believe that God wants a part of as well. That part of the reason we're here, part of the reason that we have an option to leave him is because he wants us to choose him. And that's an interesting double side. To choose him, to love him, or to leave him. Great heroes of the Bible have the same choice, had the same choice, and we see that they went through difficulties that I'm sure that they didn't understand. Imagine Joseph when he was in prison. He had no idea why he was there, probably felt it was pretty unfair. I got to think at times he must have felt that God had abandoned him and just left him in a hole to rot. And yet we know Joseph remained faithful. Think about Israel when they were in slavery in Egypt. 400 years they were there, doing nothing but the bidding of the Egyptians. And you got to think sometimes they wondered, why? God, did you forget us? Did you just leave us here? Are we just destined to be this way for all time? Even when they were delivered from that, we know that they went to the promised land, but their attitudes weren't what they needed to be, and God turned them back. And for 40 years, they wandered in the wilderness. Another difficult experience. In fact, a lot of times when we're going through a rough time in our lives, we call it a wilderness experience. I'm sure at that point in time, Israel must have wondered, what's God doing? Is this all he had planned for us? We know they voiced it at times. Wouldn't it be better if we just went back to Egypt? At least we knew we were going to have food there. Here's one thing that's sure. When you're in the wilderness, all you see is wilderness. When you're there, you don't see the deliverance. You don't see the hope that lies in Joshua's conquest of Israel. You don't see the tremendous blessing of having a nation state of your own and being safe and secured by an army that they would be years in the future. When you're in the wilderness, all you see is wilderness. You don't know that God has a bigger plan. You don't know what his divine will is and the goals that he desires to accomplish through it. When we're in the wilderness, the perspective that we have in the wilderness seems unfair. And so God asks us, how are you going to cope when the wilderness comes? How are you going to survive that? What's your mindset when you go through the wilderness? David lets us see a little of his mindset in Psalm 23. When he says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil. Your rod and because you're with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. God doesn't promise us in this life that even his most faithful followers, that there won't be dark valleys. David certainly was one of his most faithful, dedicated followers. And God did not promise him that there would not be dark valleys. But what he did promise him is that regardless of what dark valleys lie ahead, that he was going to be with him. That he would walk through there with him. David, his mindset when he went through those dark valleys was to reach up, grasp the hand of God, and take comfort in knowing that God was going to be with him through it. That God still loved him. That God was with him even on his darkest days. Even when it seemed to him, and it did in many cases in David's life, even when it seemed to him that God was at the root, God was the cause of the dark valley. God caused his child to die. And yet David grasped his hand and continued to walk with him. Keep that in mind as we go through this study of Job. As we look at what happened to this great character. You remember last week, if you didn't get a chance to hear Dr. Youngblood last week, I recommend you go online on our website. We definitely had it put up on our website, and it's been on our YouTube channel. But listen to Dr. Youngblood's introduction of the book of Job. Some great aha moments there for me. I don't know about you. As he first of all disclosed that Job and his friends were not Israelites. They were Edomites, likely. So they had a little different perspective on God, and yet were obviously followers, faithful followers of God. And remember the Satan character that we see appear in the book of Job. He believed, Dr. Youngblood believes that that's not the devil, that that's a member of God's council who had the job or the role of being a prosecuting attorney, an accuser of sorts, of questioning, of bringing into question man's motivations. And that's exactly what he did for Job. Maybe you've had a chance to go back and read that with that perspective, and you can see that it definitely makes sense when you read it in that light. You can feel free to disagree. That's certainly your prerogative, but you read it in a different light, and it is pretty interesting what he had to say about that. But bearing that in mind and bearing Dr. Youngblood's thoughts in mind, let's kind of look at that first part of the book of Job. Chapter 1, verse 1. In the land of Uz there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen and 500 donkeys. He had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man in all the peoples of the East. His sons used to hold feasts in their homes on their birthdays, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. After a period of feasting had run its course, Job would make arrangements for them to be purified. Early in the morning, he would rise and offer a burnt sacrifice for each of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular custom. So we're introduced to Job. And as Dr. Youngblood mentioned last week, he said that there are a lot of ancient stories that have a very similar theme to this book. They were stories of other people, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, some of the Canaanite tribes, had very similar stories of a man who was a very fortunate man, a very wealthy man, but was brought low because of some test by God. and then his response to it and God's response to it. And it's as if the writer of this, and Dr. Youngblood believes that this is probably a work of poetry, a work of fiction, that Job wasn't a real man, but it was a story that was written from a Hebrew perspective and inserting the Hebrew God as the God who responds in this situation. As if to say, look at Yahweh. Look at how Yahweh would respond in a similar circumstance. Again, another interesting perspective to look at this story with. And so we have Job, a wealthy man. He's got you'll notice the numbers add up to 10 a lot, and Dr. Youngblood addressed that last week. 10's a perfect number in Old Testament literature and in apocryphal literature. And so he had 10 children. He had 10,000 of this, 10,000 of that. And you see the numbers 7 and 3, 5 and 5, again, all add up to 10. And so the demonstration there is that he was kind of a perfect guy, that he was someone who was blameless and upright. But this character, the Satan, sees something is amiss. And in verse 6, he says, one day the angels, and this is a cutaway scene. This cuts away from Job and goes to a heavenly scene that Job and his friends and his family have no access to. They don't know what's happening in heaven. And so only we can see that. In verse 6, he says, one day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan, or the Satan, also came with them. The Lord said to him, where have you come from? The Satan answered, Lord, from roaming throughout the end of the earth, going back and forth on it. Then the Lord said to him, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man of God who fears God and shuns evil. And the Satan answers, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You've blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and his herds are spread out through the land. Now stretch out your hand and strike everything that he has, and surely he will curse you to your face. Then the Lord said to Satan, very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. And then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. And in Satan's response to God's giving him this authority, he takes away everything that Job has. All of his wealth, his livestock, his servants, and ultimately his children. Everything that he had that gave him stature in his community and that gave him wealth in his place was completely gone. And the passage that Robin read for us earlier was Job's response. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I'll depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. That response is why Job is known for his patience. We've heard the phrase, you've got to have the patience of Job. And that's, in our culture, a description of just ultimate patience. Patience that goes above and beyond what we would tend to see. And Job had that kind of a spirit. He wasn't going to allow misfortune that struck him. This misfortune that struck him took away everything. He's not going to allow that to cause him to turn his back on God. Chapter 2, similar thing happens. This Satan character comes before God again. God asks if he's considered him, and he says, well, yeah, but you've protected his life, or you protected his body. If you do something to his body, if he gets sick, then surely he's going to curse you to your face. And God gives him the authority again, says you can do whatever you want to him, but you need to spare his life. And so the Satan inflicts him with this skin infection, these boils that go from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. The Bible says that Job went out on the town ash heap, which is where basically the garbage heap of town. And he sat down, and with a broken piece of pottery, he was scraping the infections on his skin. And you can see a man who's destitute, who's lost everything in life, including his health, who's unclean, nobody can touch him because of his skin disease, who's cast out from his community and from his family, who is completely destitute and without anything in this world. And then his wife comes to him. In verse 9, his wife said to him, are you still maintaining your integrity? Just curse God and die. And he replied in verse 10, you're talking like a foolish woman. shall we accept good from God and not trouble? And in all this, Job did not sin by what he said. You got to imagine that this was a wilderness time for Job. That it's a dark time for him. His thoughts, and we'll see throughout the rest of the book, are deep, and many of them filled with storms and darkness. A lot of times he's beating up on himself. Other times he's screaming out to God, God, why have you done this? If I've done something, please tell me. Allow me at least to defend myself before you. And yet he hears nothing from God until the very end. He's in the wilderness, and all he can see is wilderness. Later we'll see his friends come to him, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And they come with the intent of comforting him. And for the first 7 days, we'll see next week, they did exactly that. They said nothing. They were just with him and they wept. But then they open their mouths and we start seeing problems erupt. And that happens for a lot of us. They started speaking to him, and they started this conversation that we'll get into next time that was anything but comforting to him. But they're asking the logical questions. Is this trouble sent upon Job because of some wickedness in his life or some secret sin that was going on? And they urge him, Job, tell us what you've done. Tell God what you've done. Repent of it, and surely he'll forgive you. Surely he'll make all of this right. But Job continued to hold on to his innocence. He continued to believe that he had done nothing wrong that he knew of, and that if he did something wrong, that God needed to tell him first, and then he would do something about it. But he knew nothing of what he had done. Was this misfortune because of something he had done, or was it a test that God was giving him? I love the fact that when he's tested, when Job is tested, he tears his robes in anguish when he realizes that everything he has, including his precious children, are gone. But he bows down and he worships God. He gives God the glory and the honor and praise. When his wife says, curse God and die, he says, shall we accept from God good and not trouble? God's given us so many good things. Are we simply to be good when he blesses us? Or does relationship with him demand that we honor him regardless of what we have to go through? Do we honor him in the wilderness as well as in the land flowing with milk and honey? And I think the answer in Job is certainly we should honor him that way. So we look at the tragedy that befell Job, again, at the hand of this character, the Satan, whatever we think he might be. We see the tragedy that befell him, and we see it forms a kind of test for him. And I think we can look, and when we see the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden, we have to realize and recognize that at least a portion of what we're going through in this life is about a test. That we're being tested in this life. We're not able to physically be in the presence of God. We're not able to see him, and yet we're required to believe in him. We're required to have faith in something that we do not see. And he wants our faith to grow, to be strong, that we reach out in spiritual ways to touch him. Even when others around us are saying, God isn't there. Who are you praying to? What are you calling to? And in the midst of that, he says, still choose me. Still have faith. Trouble and hardship and difficulty are going to be a part of all of our lives. Wilderness is going to be an area that we all travel in one way or another. Agreed that some of our wildernesses are more difficult than others. Some of you I know have walked paths that I've never tread, that I would fear to tread. And I honor you and respect you as you've gone through those difficulties and trials, those severe wilderness experiences, and you've come out with the faith that you now have. Human tendency is to cry out to God and say, God, could you not have prevented this? Could you not have kept this from happening if you're all powerful? Certainly, you could see the men who were going to fly the planes into the buildings. Certainly, you can see the people who are walking into our schools with guns. Certainly, you know those things are going to happen, and yet you don't prevent them. Two things God says about that. One thing is, he says, you'll never know the things I prevent. You'll never know what that looks like because it's taken care of. You don't know what I've done in the past to prevent things that have happened. But the things that do happen, tragic and difficult, awful, horrendous, causing much loss of life, much grief, and much strife, know that even in those times and through those times, that I love you. That my love never stops. My love is always there for you and will be there for you. And in fact, the tragedy, the difficulty that happens in our lives is not the test. I think we can see from Job and his experience that the test is how we process that. Is what we do when we go through that. When those times of wilderness happen in our lives, how do we move through it? How do we engage the difficulty in our minds? Again, the human tendency is to say, God, why? Couldn't you have prevented that? God's tendency is to say, naked I came into this world, naked I'll depart. The Lord be praised. Should we accept good from the hand of God and not trouble? Giving God the glory and the honor and praise even in the wilderness. Because in the wilderness, all you can see is wilderness. But we have to trust that in God's view, there's more than that. There's more than wilderness to be seen. There's a greater plan that he has, a greater result to the test that he's giving us. Go ahead to that next slide, please. In the test some of the tests that we've talked about already, in the wilderness, we see that God had a greater plan involved. Some of it certainly involved punishing those who weren't faithful, but it also involved blessing those who were and being true to his promise. Joseph couldn't have seen what God was doing as he was in prison. Joseph didn't know the day when he was in prison that one day he would be second in command in Egypt. In fact, if you had gone to him and told him that, I'm sure he'd have thought, there's no way that's going to happen. I can't see that taking place. No, you can't see it because it's God that's orchestrating it. It's God that wants us to learn things through the wilderness, that wants us to grow in our faith, that wants us to realize that even on our darkest days, his love is still with us. His presence is still beside us, that he continues to guide and show us through the wilderness what he has for us beyond. Some of you have read the author, Joni Eareckson Tada. She has a blog and a radio show and written many books. You also, if you've read anything or know anything about her, you know that she is a paraplegic. She's confined to a wheelchair and can't move anything below her neck. She has to be constantly tended to and cared for. And all of that happened back when she was a teenager. She was involved in a diving accident. She dove into the water, hit the water wrong, and it broke her neck. That one jump, that one moment in her life changed everything. I watched an interview with her one time where the interviewer asked her a question. This was long after the accident and long after she had gone through the experience with paraplegia. And he said, if you could go back to before you jumped, to the moment before you jumped, and know that this jump would cause you the pain and the suffering that it's caused you, but also know the faith and the growth that you've realized because of it, would you jump? It almost seems like an unfair question. Do you choose the richness and maturity of your faith, or do you choose your physical health? But Joni Eareckson Tada said, if I knew all that, I would jump. Because what she had beyond, what God taught her through the wilderness, was of greater value than her physical health. I hope you've had a chance to look over the book. If you go to that last slide, the Shack, written by William P. Young. For a lot of years, I didn't read that book. And it was because of the content. The idea of a child being abducted and killed just absolutely wasn't something I was ready to deal with. And I'm still not, to be honest. I don't like to read that kind of thing. It's all too real, and so I don't generally read fiction that is difficult, that presents difficulties along those lines. Life's just full enough of that stuff. But I'm glad because of this lesson series that I was able to go back and read it. And if you've not read it, I tried to warn you. I apologize. This is going to be a spoiler moment for you. If you've been wanting to read it again, my apologies. But there's a book and a movie called The Shack. And basically it's about a man who is dealing with this sadness and grief from having lost his daughter. They were camping, and she was abducted in a moment when he was distracted. And her abductor was a serial child killer, and they couldn't find her for a long time, and she was presumed dead. Doesn't spend a lot of time on that, but it does talk about how this man, his name is Mackenzie, he goes by Mac. This man deals with the tragedy in his life, with his own guilt from having allowed this to happen to his daughter, and also his questions about, God, how could you have let that happen? And then he gets a note in the mailbox. And the note is from God, and it says, meet me at the shack. And he knew what the shack was. The shack was the place where they found evidence that this killer had taken his daughter. It was a remote shack way back in the woods. This killer had taken his daughter and had finished his deed there. He had been to the shack with the police when they found the evidence of what had happened there. And the shack for him represented his deepest, his darkest nightmare. The worst horrors of his life, and really any of us could imagine, happened there. And you can imagine when he got that note, the shack was the last place he wanted to be. And yet God invited him. Come and meet me there. Come and meet me at the shack. There's one moment in the book where he finally succumbs to this suggestion that he goes to the shack. He goes back by himself, convincing himself that he'll find nothing because he had almost convinced himself that God couldn't exist. How could a loving God ever let anything like this happen? He'd convinced himself almost that God just wasn't there. He'd backed away, and he'd almost completely lost his faith. When he got there, he found the shack much as he had seen it before. It was run down. It was disheveled. Blood stains still on the floor. And he screamed at God, where were you? Where are you? But as he started to leave and walk away, thinking his mission was in vain, thinking he was crazy, things started to transform. And the shack became this beautiful log cabin, and the site around the shack went from winter to spring. And he realized something amazing was happening. So he turned again and he goes to the door of the shack, again believing that it's God that called him there. And he could hear voices coming from within. What do? The author bears this out. When you're standing at the door of this cabin and you believe God's inside, how are you going to talk to him? What are you going to find when you go in there? Mac's relationship with God had been challenged dramatically. He had spewed all kinds of venom in God's direction. When he opened the door, was he going to find an angry God looking to punish him for his insolence? Was he going to find a small town cop who simply was aloof and condescending, who had nothing but criticism for him? As he started to knock on the door flies open, and God, in this book, takes the form of an African-American woman. And this woman comes through the door and embraces him. The embrace that she gives him is an embrace like a parent who hasn't seen their child for a long time. She hugs him so tight he has trouble breathing. And she expresses a tremendous love for him. She says, I know you've been hurt. I know you've gone through a difficult time. But I want you to know I've been there all along. And I've loved you all the way through it. I don't know what your wilderness has been or maybe is right now. Maybe some of you are feeling as if you're walking through that wilderness. And you know that as you look around, when you're in the wilderness, all you see is wilderness. It's hard to see God's love. It's hard to see his care and concern for each and every one of us. It's hard to remember that he willingly went through tragedy himself, the loss of his own son, because of his love for you and I. And yet he did. And yet he did. When we suffer, we remember that he suffered. And he suffered willingly. And he says, Jesus says it many times, different ways. I suffered willingly for you. Are you willing to do the same for me? Are you willing to see your wilderness as an opportunity to learn, as an opportunity to grow, even if it amounts to great loss? Are you willing to see it as an opportunity to know me better, to draw closer because it's just you and I walking in those dark days? Are you willing to allow it to move you, to transform you, and to make you into something that I want you to be? Are you willing to engage in the larger plan in order to see what I have for you? Later on, we'll see when God enters the picture of Job, he says, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? In other words, I've got big plans for you, Job, and you're kind of messing it up here. You need to be quiet. Listen, look, see what I'm doing for you. And know that you'll experience tremendous growth as you go through it. Indeed, when the wilderness happens, our tendency is to say, God, couldn't you have prevented it? God, couldn't you have done something to take this away? And I believe that we learn from Job that he's saying what he wants us to do is to say, what will you teach me through it? God, get me through this. Teach me through this. God loves us through our darkest days, and he desires our love despite them. If you're in a wilderness time this morning, we want to walk with you through that. That's part of what a church family is about, is walking with each other through the wilderness. Don't sit and hold that to yourself. Don't sit and hold on to your wilderness time questioning God and questioning everything that's going on. Surrender to him. Understand that God gives and he takes away, but he has his purposes. We may not always know his purposes. We may not ever know his purposes until the time we meet him in that great day. And yet we trust. We trust that he has his purposes, that he's willing to show us, that he's willing to lead us through dark valleys if we'll reach up and take his hand and walk along with him. If you have a need this morning that we can pray with you about, whether it's your wilderness or something else that's going on in your life or the lives of others, we're going to have people stationed around the auditorium here and in the foyer who would love to pray with you and help you through this. Again, those prayers and the contents of them, what you express will not be shared unless you specifically ask it to be. But we want to walk with you through those wilderness times. We want to help you to be and to learn like Job did, that God loves you all the way through it. If you have a need we can help you with, please let us know as we stand and sing this song to encourage you. I need thee every hour.